This is the story of Claire, a dedicated mother and wife, whose life unravels as she discovers her husband's shocking betrayal. Faced with danger and deception, Claire must find the strength to protect herself and her son. Through suspense, heartbreak, and newfound hope, she fights for freedom and a future built on her own terms. Dive into this emotional journey of resilience, survival, and the courage to reclaim one's life. Claire sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the early morning light spilled across the room. Her mind was already racing ahead to the day, work, getting Nolan to school, and caring for Brian, who had been confined to a wheelchair for months. His dependence on her had grown since the accident, and every day felt like a marathon of responsibilities. The physical and emotional toll weighed on her, but she pushed through, knowing that both Brian and Nolan needed her to keep everything running smoothly. At work, Claire was known for her calm under pressure. She handled demanding tasks with grace, but no one saw the burdens she carried at home. After a long day at the office, she would return to Brian's side, helping him with everything from meals to mobility. It was exhausting, but she never complained. Each evening, she would smile for Nolan, pretending everything was fine, even though she was running on empty. Claire's loyalty to her family was unwavering, even when it cost her everything. One quiet afternoon at the office, Claire found herself chatting with Naomi by the coffee machine. Naomi, always thoughtful, made a casual comment that stuck with Claire. "You know," she said, "sometimes the strongest people are the ones quietly carrying the most." Claire smiled, brushing it off as just an observation. She didn't think much of it at the time, too focused on getting through her day. Still, the words lingered in the back of her mind, almost as if they were meant for her. Later that evening, Claire was back at home, juggling Nolan's homework and helping Brian with his wheelchair. As she moved through her usual routine, Naomi's words echoed again. Was Claire one of those people, quietly bearing the weight of everyone around her? She shook the thought away, reminding herself that she was strong enough to handle it all. After all, she had to be. With so many people depending on her, there wasn't time to feel fragile. One evening, Claire noticed something unsettling about Brian. He seemed more alert than usual, his eyes flicking to his phone when he thought she wasn't watching. His hands were quicker, more sure, which struck her as odd given his supposed condition. As she helped him with his wheelchair, the suspicion that something wasn't right gnawed at her. The thought lingered, even as she tried to convince herself that she was just overtired from balancing work and family. But deep down, she knew something was off. A few days later, after another strange interaction where Brian hurried to take a call in private, Claire decided she couldn't ignore it any longer. That afternoon during lunch break, she walked to a nearby electronics store. Her heart pounded as she scanned the shelves, pretending she was just browsing. Then she saw it, a small, discreet spy camera that could easily be hidden in her home. Feeling a mix of guilt and determination, Claire bought it. The idea of spying on her husband felt wrong, but her gut told her it was the only way to get the truth. Back home, Claire waited for the right moment. That evening, after dinner, Brian announced he was going to take a long bath, a routine he'd developed lately, disappearing for nearly an hour each time. It was her chance. As soon as she heard the water running, Claire moved quickly. She positioned the camera behind a stack of books on the shelf, carefully angling it to capture the living room where Brian spent most of his day. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the device, her heart racing at the thought of what she might uncover. When Brian came out of the bathroom, Claire acted as if nothing had changed. She forced herself to smile through their usual routine, helping him settle back into his wheelchair and asking about his day. But inside, her nerves were on edge, knowing that everything was now being recorded. She felt guilty, but she had to know. What if he wasn't being honest with her? The thought of betrayal was too painful to fully accept, but the camera would give her the proof she needed. Over the next few days, Claire carried on as normal, though her mind was constantly on the hidden camera. Every time she looked at Brian, the tension inside her tightened. She hadn't dared to review the footage yet, too afraid of what she might see. But she knew that at some point, she'd have to face the truth. And when that moment came, it would change everything. The camera sat hidden behind the books for days, silently recording, but Claire couldn't bring herself to watch the footage. Every night, after putting Nolan to bed and settling Brian into his usual spot in the living room, she would glance at the bookshelf, knowing that the answers were right there, just a click away. Yet, every time she reached for the camera, her hand hesitated. Was she ready for what it might reveal? The idea of seeing Brian betray her trust was unbearable, but so was the constant doubt gnawing at her. Claire found herself torn between her suspicions and her guilt. Brian was the man she had loved for years, the father of her child. If he was truly conspiring against her, how could she live with that knowledge? On the other hand, if she was wrong, if it was all in her head, how could she justify spying on him? The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her shoulders, making each day harder to bear. Am I crossing a line? She wondered late at night, lying awake in bed. At work, Claire's focus began to waver. Naomi noticed the tension in her, asking if everything was okay. Claire, unable to tell the truth, just nodded and forced a smile. She felt as though she was living a double life, one where everything seemed normal on the outside, but inside, her world was slowly unraveling. Every time she helped Brian with something, she felt the sting of doubt. Was his need for her real, or had it all been an act? The uncertainty weighed on her, leaving her feeling more trapped than ever. Days turned into a week, and still, Claire couldn't make herself watch the recordings. She thought of Nolan, of how this could affect him if things between her and Brian fell apart. Would she be tearing their family apart based on a suspicion? The thought of Nolan getting caught in the middle of all this broke her heart. But then again, if Brian was truly deceiving her, how could she stay silent? Claire felt herself on the edge, knowing she had to make a decision soon. One evening, as Brian settled into bed earlier than usual, Claire sat alone in the living room, staring at the bookshelf where the camera lay hidden. Her hands trembled as she finally reached for it, the weight of her decision almost too much to bear. I have to know, she whispered to herself. Her mind raced as she plugged the camera into her laptop, the screen lighting up with the recorded footage. Taking a deep breath, Claire pressed play, bracing herself for whatever truth would unfold. Claire's heart pounded as the footage began to play. At first, it was just the normal, mundane moments she had come to expect, Brian moving around the living room, adjusting himself in the wheelchair, or watching TV. But then, something caught her eye. A woman appeared on the screen. Claire's stomach dropped. The woman was tall, with dark hair, and she moved through the house as if she belonged there. Claire had never seen her before. Who is she? Claire whispered, her hands gripping the laptop tighter. As Claire watched, the woman, Skylar, she heard Brian call her, sat next to him, their conversation casual at first, then shifting into something more sinister. Claire's blood ran cold when she heard them talk about her, about the house, about their plan. She doesn't suspect a thing, Brian said, his voice disturbingly calm. We'll have everything soon enough. Just a little more time. Claire couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her husband, the man she had cared for, was conspiring against her, planning to take everything and leave her with nothing. Claire hit pause, her chest heaving as the betrayal sank in. For a few minutes, she just sat there, numb. The room around her felt distant, and her thoughts were spinning, unable to settle on one thing. She had suspected something was wrong, but this? This was more than she had imagined. Brian was not just hiding something, he was planning to destroy her life. She felt sick, the weight of the truth crashing down on her like a wave. Everything she thought she knew about her marriage, about Brian, was a lie. As the initial shock passed, something else began to take its place, anger. Claire's fingers tightened around the laptop as she hit play again, determined to hear it all. Skylar and Brian discussed the details of their scheme, including plans to siphon money from Claire's accounts and slowly eliminate her from the picture. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and fury. She couldn't believe she had been so blind, so trusting. But now that she knew the truth, she had to act. Brian wasn't going to get away with this. That night, Claire didn't sleep. She sat in the darkness, her mind racing as she planned her next steps. She knew she couldn't confront Brian directly, not yet. She needed more proof, and she needed a plan. Nolan's safety was her top priority, and she had to protect him from whatever chaos would come next. But one thing was clear, Claire wasn't going to be the victim. Not anymore. It was time to take control of her life and expose Brian for the liar he truly was. In the days following her discovery, Claire found herself gravitating more toward George, her boss. He had always been kind, but lately, his concern for her had deepened. One afternoon, after a tough meeting, George pulled her aside. "You seem distracted, Claire." "Everything okay?" he asked, his eyes soft with concern. Claire hesitated but felt a sense of safety in his presence, though she didn't reveal the full extent of her troubles. She wasn't ready to open up about Brian, but just talking to George gave her a small sense of relief. Over time, their conversations became more personal, though Claire still held back the details of her crumbling marriage. George, ever supportive, seemed to sense the burden she carried. "You don't always have to be the strong one," he said during one of their talks, his words gently breaking through her guarded exterior. His calm demeanor became a refuge for Claire, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding at home. Though her feelings for him were growing, she wasn't ready to embrace them. There was too much to sort out first. Even as the tension at home increased, Claire looked forward to seeing George at work. His steady presence was a source of comfort she hadn't realized she needed. Though she was still focused on gathering evidence against Brian and protecting Nolan, the moments she spent with George reminded her that she wasn't entirely alone in this battle. He was becoming more than just a colleague, he was her silent ally, someone who made her feel seen during a time when her life felt like it was unraveling. With the spy camera still in place, Claire began to play a dangerous game of her own. Each day, she pretended everything was normal, smiling at Brian, helping him with his wheelchair, and even engaging in light conversation, all while knowing what he was truly up to. Every evening, once Brian was asleep, Claire would review the footage, carefully documenting everything she needed to build her case. The more she watched, the clearer it became. Brian and Skylar were not only conspiring to take her money but also planning to slowly poison her to make it look like a natural death. Her heart raced every time she watched the videos, but she knew she had to stay calm. Confronting Brian too early would ruin everything. So, she played her part perfectly, hiding her fear and anger behind a mask of normalcy. The stakes were high, and Claire couldn't afford to make a mistake. During the day, she went to work, where George provided her with quiet support, though he had no idea about the full extent of what was happening. At night, she returned home, carefully gathering more evidence while pretending not to know the truth. As the days passed, Claire became more strategic. She started subtly questioning Brian about his health, asking him if he felt any improvement or if his medication seemed to be helping. Brian, completely unaware that Claire knew his secret, continued to play the role of the helpless husband, but Claire's careful observations made it clear that he was getting impatient. Skylar was visiting more frequently now, always when Claire was out, and their plans were clearly accelerating. Claire knew she had to move quickly, but she wasn't ready to strike just yet. The tension in the house became almost unbearable, but Claire maintained her composure. She needed more proof, more time to set her plan in motion. At work, she started dropping hints to George that things at home were more complicated than they seemed. Though she didn't reveal everything, George sensed that Claire was in trouble and made it clear he was there for her, no matter what. Claire appreciated his support, but she knew she couldn't involve him too deeply, not yet. This was her battle, and she needed to handle it carefully. Despite the mounting danger, there was a strange sense of empowerment that came with knowing Brian's secret. For the first time in years, Claire felt like she had control over her life again, even if it was built on deception. She wasn't the passive, overworked wife anymore, she was the one pulling the strings now, and Brian had no idea what was coming for him. Claire's quiet determination grew stronger each day, as she carefully plotted her next move, knowing that soon, everything would come crashing down. Claire could feel the tension growing with each passing day. The weight of what she knew pressed down on her constantly, but she also felt her resolve strengthening. One evening, after Skylar had left the house, Claire decided it was time to confront Brian, partially. She couldn't expose everything yet, but she needed to test the waters. "Brian," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her, "I've been thinking, you don't seem as sick as you used to." Brian's eyes flicked up, a brief flash of something like panic crossing his face before he quickly masked it with a weak smile. "What do you mean?" Brian asked, his voice full of practiced innocence. Claire narrowed her eyes slightly, watching him closely. "I don't know. You just seem stronger lately." "Maybe the treatments are working," she suggested, keeping her tone light but probing. Brian hesitated, his grip tightening slightly on the armrest of his wheelchair. "It's been slow," he said, trying to sound convincing. But Claire could see the cracks in his performance. He was nervous, though he did his best to hide it. That small reaction was enough to confirm her suspicions. Over the next few days, Brian's behavior shifted. He became more distant, avoiding Claire whenever possible, and his temper grew shorter. The conversation had clearly rattled him. Claire felt a mix of satisfaction and unease. She had gotten under his skin, but now he was on alert. Still, she had to push forward. She couldn't let him think he was winning. Each night, she continued to review the footage, documenting everything, knowing that her moment to strike was coming soon. But the confrontation had left her shaken, too. What if she wasn't strong enough to face him head-on when the time came? One evening, Claire confided in George a little more than usual. Over coffee, she told him, "Things at home are complicated. I'm dealing with something, and I can't go into details, but I'm not sure how much longer I can handle it." George looked at her with deep concern. "You don't have to do this alone, Claire. You know that, right?" he said, his voice steady. Claire smiled weakly, grateful for his support but knowing that this was something she still had to face on her own, for now. George's presence comforted her, but it didn't erase the fear building inside her. The confrontation with Brian had left Claire feeling vulnerable, questioning whether she could see this through. He had almost made her doubt herself, manipulating her emotions like he had done so many times before. But Claire refused to let him win. She would find the strength to fight back, no matter how hard it became. And with George quietly supporting her from the sidelines, Claire felt a small glimmer of hope in the darkness. She wasn't alone, she just had to survive a little longer before the truth came to light. Brian's patience was wearing thin, and Skylar's visits to the house were becoming more frequent and bold. Claire could feel the tension rising in the air, their plans speeding up with each passing day. She continued to play her role, acting as if nothing was wrong, but she knew they were on the verge of making their move. Every glance Brian gave her felt colder, more calculating, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The sense of danger loomed larger with every step she took. One evening, while preparing dinner, Claire overheard Brian on the phone with Skylar. His tone was urgent, and Claire caught enough of the conversation to understand that they were planning to move faster. "She's catching on," Brian whispered. Claire's heart raced as she realized they were growing impatient, and their plans to take her down were quickly escalating. She knew she had to act soon, but she needed to be careful. One wrong move could ruin everything. The pressure of staying ahead of them was becoming unbearable. Meanwhile, at work, George noticed the change in Claire. "You've seemed different lately," he said, his concern evident. Claire brushed it off with a smile, but George could sense something was wrong. His quiet support gave her strength, but she couldn't tell him the full truth yet. Skylar and Brian were circling closer, and Claire knew the moment of confrontation was coming. She had to be ready, not only to expose them but to protect herself and Nolan from the danger that was now closing in on all sides. The breaking point came one afternoon when Nolan innocently mentioned something he had seen to Brian. "Dad, I saw the little camera Mom put up," he said, not understanding the significance of his words. Claire froze from across the room, her heart dropping into her stomach. Brian's expression shifted instantly, his eyes narrowing as he turned to look at her. Claire knew, in that moment, that her secret was out. The surveillance she had so carefully hidden had been exposed by the one person she had been trying to protect. The atmosphere in the house changed immediately. Brian's demeanor darkened, and his interactions with Claire became sharper, more hostile. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Claire could feel Brian's gaze burning into her back. He didn't say anything, but the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Claire's mind raced, trying to figure out what Brian would do next. He knew about the camera now, and there was no doubt in her mind that he would accelerate their plan. She needed to act, but fear paralyzed her. Later that night, as Claire lay in bed, her mind spinning with fear and regret, she heard Brian's voice from the other room. He was on the phone, speaking in low tones, but this time she caught every word. "We need to move now." "I'm not waiting any longer," he said, his tone cold and resolute. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The full weight of the danger she and Nolan were in hit her like a freight train. She had lost control of the situation, and now her life, and her son's, was in immediate jeopardy. In the days that followed, Claire felt like a prisoner in her own home. Brian watched her closely, his behavior increasingly erratic, and Skylar's visits became more frequent. Claire knew they were preparing for the final step of their plan, poisoning her slowly, making it look like a natural illness. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to protect Nolan, and she had to protect herself. But every option seemed dangerous, every move a risk. For the first time, Claire felt truly trapped, with no clear way out. Everything felt lost. Claire could barely think through the fear, the regret of not acting sooner weighing heavily on her. She was terrified for Nolan, terrified for herself, and the realization that she had allowed this situation to spiral so far out of control was crushing. But beneath the fear, a small spark of resolve flickered. Claire wasn't done yet. She had come too far to let Brian and Skylar win. She would find a way out of this, no matter the cost. Claire sat alone in the quiet of the living room, feeling the weight of her world collapsing around her. Brian's plans were accelerating, and the house, once a place of safety, now felt like a cage closing in. Guilt gnawed at her. How had she allowed things to reach this point? Every decision she had made seemed like a mistake, and the fear of what might happen next was suffocating. She had always been the strong one, but now, Claire felt like she was breaking. In the darkness, Claire realized that her fear had almost paralyzed her. But deep down, she knew she couldn't give up. She had to protect Nolan, and she had to find a way to survive. Even though it seemed impossible, Claire made a silent promise to herself: she would fight back. She would find the strength to face Brian and Skylar, no matter how lost she felt right now. Claire wasn't done yet. The next morning, Claire woke up with a renewed sense of determination. The fear was still there, but beneath it, she felt the spark of something stronger: resolve. She couldn't wait any longer. With Brian and Skylar pushing their plan forward, it was time for her to act. She couldn't do it alone, though. After all this time, Claire knew she needed help. And the only person she could trust with the truth was George. That afternoon, she pulled him aside at work and told him everything. George listened in silence, his face growing more serious with each word. When she finished, he looked at her with a steady resolve. "I've got your back," he said firmly. Together, they came up with a plan. George had connections with local law enforcement, and through his help, Claire was able to arrange for the police to be involved in her final confrontation with Brian. They decided to set a trap. They would disable Brian's wheelchair, exposing the fact that he was never truly dependent on it. With George's support, Claire felt stronger than she had in weeks. That evening, she returned home, calm but focused. She checked the camera one last time, making sure it captured enough evidence. Brian and Skylar wouldn't see it coming. The next morning, Claire acted as if it were a normal day, but everything was in place. George had coordinated with the police, who were ready to intervene at the right moment. After breakfast, Brian rolled into the living room, his mood colder than usual. Claire's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "Brian," she began, her words carefully chosen, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time we talked about everything that's been happening." He looked at her suspiciously, but before he could respond, his wheelchair suddenly stopped moving. Confused, he tried to adjust it, but nothing worked. For a moment, the silence hung heavy in the air. Then, slowly, Brian stood up from the chair, his expression filled with panic as he realized what had just happened. Claire stood her ground, her heart racing, but her resolve unshaken. "You don't need the wheelchair, do you?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The trap had been set, and as Brian stood frozen in the middle of the room, the police entered. Claire stepped back, watching as the reality of his deception began to unravel before him. She had won the first battle. As Brian and Skylar were taken into custody, Claire felt the weight lifting from her chest. She had exposed them for the liars they were, and though the fight wasn't over yet, she knew she was finally in control. George stood by her side, offering a comforting hand on her shoulder as she took a deep breath. For the first time in months, Claire felt like she could breathe again. The nightmare wasn't quite over, but the worst was behind her, and she had survived. With Brian and Skylar now in custody, Claire felt the heavy cloud that had been hanging over her life begin to lift. The house was quieter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel like she was walking on eggshells. The police had taken all the evidence she'd gathered, and the truth about Brian's deception was beginning to unfold publicly. Claire sat with Nolan that evening, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Is Dad coming back?" Nolan asked quietly, his eyes searching hers. Claire smiled gently, her heart aching, but she knew she had to be honest. "No, honey. He's not coming back." The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, police interviews, and media attention. But through it all, Claire held her head high. She had survived something unimaginable, and now, she was rebuilding. George became an even bigger presence in her life, offering steady support through the aftermath. He didn't push her for more than she could handle, but his quiet strength became something Claire leaned on more and more. It was strange to feel safe again, but with George by her side, she was beginning to trust in the future. One afternoon, after yet another meeting with the police, Claire found herself sitting in her kitchen, sipping tea and reflecting on everything that had happened. The weight of what she had lost was still there, her marriage, her trust in Brian, but the sense of freedom she felt now was undeniable. She had been to the edge, and she had come back stronger. Nolan was adjusting too, slowly understanding the changes in their family dynamic. He seemed happier, more at ease, and that was all Claire had ever wanted for him. As the days turned into weeks, Claire began to allow herself to dream again. Her relationship with George deepened naturally, without any pressure. They spent more time together, and slowly, the friendship that had anchored her through the darkest moments of her life blossomed into something more. George had been her ally when she felt most alone, and now, as she started this new chapter, Claire felt a growing warmth between them. She was no longer trapped in a life of lies, she was free to build a future that she could truly call her own. The final confrontation had passed, and Claire knew there would still be challenges ahead. But as she looked around her home, the same place that had once felt like a cage, she now saw possibility. She had reclaimed her life, and with George and Nolan by her side, she felt stronger than she ever had before. Whatever came next, Claire knew she was ready for it. She was finally free to live on her own terms. In the weeks that followed Brian's arrest, Claire felt a sense of peace settling into her life. The legal process was still ongoing, but the immediate danger had passed, and she could finally start to rebuild. The house, once filled with tension and secrets, was now a place of healing. Claire had worked hard to make it feel like home again, not just for herself but for Nolan, who was adjusting to their new life with surprising resilience. "It feels different now, Mom," he said one evening. Claire nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Different, and better. George had become a steady presence in their lives, visiting often and spending time with both Claire and Nolan. What had begun as support in her darkest hours had grown into something more. They didn't rush things, but the closeness between them was undeniable. Claire appreciated how patient and understanding George was, never pushing her beyond what she was ready for. Slowly, the boundaries between friendship and something deeper began to blur, and for the first time in a long time, Claire allowed herself to feel hopeful about love again. As the court case progressed, more details about Brian and Skylar's conspiracy came to light. It was hard to hear how deeply the deception had run, but Claire faced it with the strength she had rediscovered. Each new revelation was like a final piece of a puzzle she had spent months trying to solve. There were moments when the weight of it all still hit her, when she thought about how much trust she had given Brian, only to have it shattered. But those moments were fewer now, and Claire focused on the future, on what she was building, not what she had lost. One Saturday afternoon, Claire and George took Nolan to the park. It was a simple day, filled with laughter, as Nolan raced around, playing in the sunshine. Claire watched him, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. George sat beside her on the park bench, their hands brushing briefly before clasping together naturally. "It's nice to see you smile like that," George said, his voice soft. Claire turned to him, smiling wider. "It feels good," she admitted, and for the first time, she truly meant it. She had made it through the storm and was ready for what came next. In those quiet moments, Claire realized just how far she had come. She wasn't the woman who had been trapped in fear and deception anymore. She had found her strength, reclaimed her life, and built a future she could be proud of. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but with George by her side and Nolan thriving, Claire felt a deep sense of peace. She was finally free, finally living on her own terms, and as she looked out at the bright day ahead, she knew she could handle anything that came her way. On a bright autumn morning, Claire, George, and Nolan walked through the park together, the leaves crunching under their feet. The air was crisp, and the sun cast a golden hue over everything. Nolan ran ahead, his laughter echoing through the trees as he chased a squirrel. Claire and George walked side by side, their hands intertwined, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about how far they had come. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill her lungs, and for the first time in what felt like years, she felt truly at peace. They reached a small bench by the lake, where they often sat during their weekend walks. George glanced at Claire and smiled warmly. "You did it, you know," he said softly. Claire looked at him, her brow furrowed in gentle confusion. "Did what?" she asked, her voice soft. George squeezed her hand. "You survived. You made it through all of it, and look where you are now." Claire paused, letting his words sink in. She glanced at Nolan, who was now sitting by the water's edge, skipping stones. A sense of pride and relief washed over her. Sitting on the bench, Claire watched the ripples in the water, the gentle waves reflecting the sunlight. She couldn't help but smile as she thought about everything she had overcome. The fear, the deception, the heartbreak, it was all behind her now. What lay ahead was a life she had built on her own terms, free from the lies that once suffocated her. George's presence beside her was a quiet reminder of the love and support she had found along the way. She squeezed his hand back, her heart light. As Nolan ran back toward them, his face flushed with excitement, Claire felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Mom, did you see how far that stone went?" he asked, his eyes wide with pride. Claire chuckled and nodded, ruffling his hair. "I did, sweetheart. You're getting really good at that," she replied. In that moment, everything felt right. The past was behind them, and the future, full of possibility, stretched out in front of them like the clear blue sky above. With the sunlight warming her face and the sound of Nolan's laughter filling the air, Claire knew she had finally found her peace. The life she had once feared was lost was now filled with hope and love. As she leaned into George's shoulder, watching her son run off again, Claire smiled. She was free. She had found herself again, and the future was hers to embrace.